Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Rahul Reddy from Career Launcher Bangalore. This is for our. Okay, good evening, everyone. This is Rahul Reddy from Career Launcher Bangalore. So, we are today looking at the AWT or Analytical Writing Assessment, which is exclusive to the IIM Ahmedabad uh, interview process. Now, this is a little different. Typically, we would have prepared for the WAT sessions, and this is a little different and exclusive only to IIM Ahmedabad. So, I think it makes sense for us to discuss, go in depth on how we handle this particular task that is in front of us. Okay. So first is very quickly, what's the difference? We all have WAT in almost a lot of the B schools. So what's the difference? A WAT topic would be simply a topic, something like one sentence, maybe two, right? So as example, are smartphones dangerous for human beings, right? So discuss. Now you get a choice to decide whether they're dangerous, and you can make an argument that they are dangerous. You could make an argument that they are actually useful and not really dangerous. Or you could say that, look, they are actually useful but can be dangerous under certain circumstances. Right? You can take a nuanced approach. So in WAT, you build an argument support it with evidence, and then you come to a conclusion. But in AWT, what you actually have is an argument is given to you. Right? So for example, we have an argument here. Lying the right way can be beneficial as it can build strong connections and help us get ahead in life. Right? So again, remember, when there is an argument, there's always a conclusion. So what's the conclusion here? It is important that we embrace the power of lying and use it to our advantage. So the author is making the case that lying is useful and we should learn how to lie and we should use it to our advantage. And especially not just lying in the right way. And we should teach people how to lie because it's a valuable skill. Now, in support of this particular conclusion, the author provides certain evidence, right, which we call as premises. Right? And to also illustrate the argument, the author gives some examples. Right? So, a full-fledged argument is given to you with a conclusion, with premises or evidence, and also with some examples at certain times which illustrate the argument. Now, what is your task? Your task is to say, okay, how good is this argument? Right? You are here to evaluate an argument. People who have, sometimes studied or prepared for GMAT understand something called analysis of arguments. Right? So that is exactly what we're doing. We're analyzing whether this argument is a strong argument, a good argument, what are the mistakes, what are the flaws in this particular argument. Right? Okay, so let's see how we do this. Right? So first thing is, let's break down the argument, dissect it, and say, okay, take parts and say label them. Okay, what is the conclusion? What are the supporting premises? Are there any assumptions? Are there any examples? And then what are the possible mistakes or gaps in logic that are there in this particular argument? Okay, so let's start. What would be the conclusion here? Conclusion is the purpose for which an argument is being written. Ask the question, what exactly is the author trying to prove? What is he or she trying to convince you? Okay, so clearly, right? So the author is basically trying to say that lying is a good thing and we should use it to our advantage. That's the conclusion that the author is trying to. Okay, now, on what basis? What are supporting premises? Right? He's basically saying that it's a skill. It will be useful in personal life. It will also be useful in professional life. That is a supporting argument. He gives an example of personal life, right? For example, a kid has broken a toy, right? Rather than admit the truth and say, yes, I was playing with it, I broke the toy, it is better to say, I don't know how the toy broke. Similarly, if an employee knows that a project will not be completed on time, why accept it? You say that, yeah, it will be, completed on time. Because if you say that it won't be completed on time, then people will blame you for it. There will be arguments that it has to be completed on time, and then it creates conflict, negative consequences. But if you simply say that it's on, everything is on time, then you can avoid the negative consequences. Now, with the examples, he's making a case that it is good for lying, is good for personal life, it is good for professional life. Then we have to look at what are the gaps in the logic. Is it really good? If you say that a project will be completed on time, knowing that it is not going to be completed on time, are you actually avoiding the negative consequences, or are you only deferring them to a later stage? That as of today you avoid the negative consequences, but at a later point of time they could be even bigger negative consequences. Similarly, are we taking a very short-term view that the parent will never find out who broke the toy? And once the parent finds out that the kid is lying, would that lead to a loss of trust? So these are some of the flaws or gaps in the logic. Is it therefore good in professional life? Once you're identified as a person who cannot be trusted, does it actually help you in your professional life? Similarly, once you are established that you are not honest, is it good for you in your personal life? So you can make the case that the arguments are flawed for XYZ reasons, and therefore you give your recommendations. Right? So these are some of the questions that you have to ask. We know what the conclusion is, but what is the line of reasoning used? Why does the author say that lying is good? Okay. What are the flaws? What are the evidence that actually support the argument? What are the evidence that can weaken the argument? Right? So what are the arguments the author is using, and what are the kind of arguments that could counter the position held by the author? Okay, let's take a few more examples. What we'll do is we'll take a few more examples, then we will look at one particular case and do a deep dive, and actually kind of sort it, break it down, identify the flaws, and build a AWT essay on it. Right? We'll do it with one case, and then maybe one or two more examples we'll broadly discuss. Okay, that should give you a pretty good idea. So for example, here, giving space to teenagers in today's world is a bad idea. What is this sentence? The first sentence? It's a conclusion. Right? Author is making a conclusion. The same conclusion is repeated in different words in the end. Giving space is wrong and leads to unhealthy relationship. So that's really the last sentence, which comes after therefore is a conclusion. Now, once you know what the conclusion is, ask why. Why is it wrong? Why does it lead to unhealthy relationship? That leads to the premises. It creates distance. That's a claim made by the author. It can negatively affect relationship with family members. Right? So giving space creates distance, and distance is bad in society, and the family also might get offended. Therefore, it is bad for relationships. Therefore, giving space is a bad. And then now we understood what is the claims, what is the conclusion. Then we'll say, okay, what are the kind of flaws that we are looking at? So clearly here, the author is making a claim, but is not providing any kind of evidence. Is giving space actually bad? Does it harm relationship? The author is making a claim, not really providing any evidence. Second, he is not defining space in terms of what exactly does it mean, and he's making a blanket assertion that giving any space is a bad thing. He's not saying giving too much space. There's no qualification. He's not saying that giving too much space is a bad thing. Okay, or he's basically saying that giving too much freedom is a problem. Some space can be given. He's not making any qualifier. He's making a very general statement. Similarly, he does not look at which teenagers. There's no qualifier there. Right? All teenagers are not the same. He's not looking at the social and cultural context. Are we talking about Indian teenagers? Are we talking about Japanese teenagers? Are we talking about American teenagers? Within India, are we talking about urban teenagers of a Bangalore NCR? Are we talking about a small town teenager in maybe Tiruchinappalli or Hosur or Ballari? Or are we talking about teenagers in small villages? Because culturally, there is a difference. Similarly, there is a direct cause-effect relationship. If you give space, it creates distance. Distance is bad, therefore unhealthy relationship. Is it a straightforward cause and effect relationship? Is this the only cause of unhealthy relationships? What about other things like communication? What about the positive? Can giving space lead to positive effects like development of maturity, decision making, independence? Is it good for emotional growth? These are all the possible counter arguments that you could make. Okay. Another claim that we are here. Now, it's interesting here, right? You could start with the conclusion, then arrive at the premises, or you could directly identify the premises also. What are premises? Basically facts. Something which are not opinions, things which can be verified. Food delivery partners are underpaid, underappreciated, and unprotected. The claim made by the author. Are they really underpaid, underappreciated, unprotected? We're not really sure. That's a claim made by the author. The delivery industry relies on these workers who are often underpaid and disrespected. Again, the author is making a claim. Does the author provide proof? Not really. What kind of proof? For example, if the author can say that, look, they are forced to work 10 hours or 12 hours a week, that could be evidence that they are exploited. Suppose the author gives some evidence that they make barely 30 rupees per delivery. That could be evidence that they are being under. Right? If the author provides evidence that they are forced to go fast to meet their time deadlines, that they are not provided protective equipment like good quality helmets, that could give evidence that they are unprotected. Right? So understand the difference between claims and evidence. Okay. Then the author says some customers may say they cannot do anything and the company is solely responsible for employee treatment. So a customer might say, look, they are not my employees. They are the employees of an Amazon or a Swiggy or a Zepto or a Blinkit. Therefore, these companies are responsible for the treatment of employees. The author disagrees. The author says consumers can make a difference by supporting companies that treat their workers fairly and avoid those that don't. So in a sense, he's saying consumers, if they say that, look, I will not order from Swiggy, as an example, that Swiggy does not pay its delivery workers properly, does not respect them, does not protect them, exploits them, therefore I will avoid Swiggy. Now this will put pressure on the company that, look, consumers are boycotting me, and the only way to avoid boycott and win back the customers is by making sure that the workers are treated well. So that's the kind of argument that the author is. Again, there are some assumptions. The assumption is that some companies are there which provide the same service and treat workers fairly. For example, if my choice is between Swiggy and Zomato and both have the same pay structure and both have the same or almost the same working hours, then how can I make a choice? I can't. Second, there is an assumption that consumers know which company treats workers fairly. For example, do I know how much Swiggy pays the delivery workers? Do I know how much Zomato pays delivery workers or Blinkit pays? Because if I don't know the payment, if I don't know the pay structure, then how can I choose a company and then I don't know which company treats the workers fairly. So that's an assumption that is being. So if you go fairly deep, you will understand that there are a lot of issues, right? And in many cases, because these arguments are reasonably small in size, they will include things like generalizations. They would lack evidence. They would probably be create a causal relationship which is probably not valid, and there could be other logical gaps in the argument. Okay, the good thing is, yes, you have only 20 minutes. You don't need to identify every possible gap in the argument. Ideally, if you can identify 2 reasonably good flaws in the argument, that would be enough to write a good essay. Right? Because we understand that if you take a lot of time and analyze, you get a lot of ideas. We don't have that kind of time, right? We have 20 minutes for the entire AWT setup. So let's see how it works. We've covered this. So once we ask the questions, right, you can answer the questions one by one. Fundamentally, you're writing about 3 to 4 paragraphs, which effectively covers the questions that you asked, right? What is the author's conclusion? What is the evidence provided? Is the argument logically correct? What are the flaws? And therefore, what kind of conclusion that you would write about the quality of the argument? What is your assessment about the quality of the argument given to you? Right? So typically, this is similar to what we suggested in WAT also. Even though the time is short, you would still cannot straight away start writing. You need to balance between planning and actually writing the essay. So if 20 minutes is given, then we basically says that, okay, take it as 5 and 15. 25 minutes is given, take it as 5 minutes and 20 minutes. Right? You may need a minimum of 5 minutes to plan. Otherwise, you will not get a structured essay. Right? The basic structure of the essay is still the same. Start with your conclusion. What is it that you want to say? Explain it and then repeat your conclusion in different words. Remember, that is exactly how the main argument in the examples we have seen, it is exactly like that. It starts by saying lying may be beneficial, ends by saying lying is good. Similarly, it starts by saying giving space is bad, again ends by saying, right? Do not try to build any suspense and say that this is a thriller, I will reveal the suspense in the end. No. Be clear, this is what I'm going to tell you. Then explain it and then repeat or reassert the same conclusion again. Right? So how do you start? You start by saying, okay, this is the argument that the author is making, and break it down. Right? This is the conclusion that the author is making in the given argument. This is the evidence that the author is providing. Then you start by saying, but the argument given suffers from these particular flaws. Then I explain the first flaw, I explain the second flaw, and then kind of give my recommendation in the end. Okay. So for example, if we are taking the lying wala, we say the author makes the argument that lying is beneficial in personal and professional life. He supports the argument by saying that it avoids conflict and therefore is beneficial in the personal and professional life, and that kids and employees should be taught how to. Then you say this particular argument suffers from the flaws that the author is taking a very short-term view and does not talk about the long-term consequences of lying, including the lack of trust that sets in between people. Then you talk about the first flaw, the second flaw. Okay, first flaw, you could say what happens when what happens to personal relationships which are built on lies. Second flaw, you can talk about what happens to professional relationships which are built on lies, and then give you a recommendation, and then say that in the long term it is much better to build both personal and professional relationships on truth and honesty, building trust rather than trying to avoid short-term conflict through lies. Okay. So let's take an example. Just take 2 minutes, try and understand this particular thing, right? Okay. Now, do understand that we are talking a lot about flaws of the argument. That doesn't mean that if certain cases the evidence is reasonably good, right? So typically the conclusion that you will come up may not be a complete refutation of the argument made. You can provide a more nuanced. Okay, the lying part is a little difficult to provide nuance, so it becomes a refutation of the argument, right? But if you take the space part, right, for example, which one? This one, right? If you look at this one, right, here it makes sense for us to provide more nuance, saying that giving space by itself is not a bad thing. It does not automatically create distance, especially if good communication is there between family members. However, there is a risk that when you give too much space, it ends up creating distance. Therefore, it is important to find the right balance between giving space and good communication and spending quality time with each other, that kind of stuff. So this gives you this particular argument, you come with a more nuanced argument. Okay. Now let's take a slightly deep dive into one particular topic and see how it works, right? Now this is one topic where the argument looks fairly strong. Just read it for a minute, think about it. Right? The conclusion is clearly given. Photographers who work in color have an advantage over those who work in black and white. That's the conclusion. Why? Why do they have an advantage? What is the evidence the author is giving? Right? He gives 3 examples. Magazines use more color photographs than black and white. Right? So magazines use more color photographs than black and whites, which means that if a photographer wishes to have his or her photos published in a magazine, then it is easier if he works with color. Similarly, many newspapers are also starting to use color photographs. Again, a similar argument, if you want your photographs to be published in newspapers, it makes sense to use color because increasingly newspapers are also using color photographs. Similarly, most portrait studios also use color films more than black and white film. Right? So again, as a photographer, if you'd like to work in portrait studios, then again, because most portrait studios work with color, it makes sense for you to use color. Therefore, these are the 3 arguments given. Okay, the last argument is there are more types of color film than black and white film available. So clearly this is an old example. We are still talking about film-based cameras instead of digital cameras, but still. Right? So on the face of it, this argument looks quite strong, doesn't it? Right? There are very nice arguments given that look, magazines are using color photographs much more than black and white. Newspapers, which traditionally were black and white, are also starting to use color now. And most portrait studios are also using black and white. And for all these reasons, photographers who work in color have an advantage over those who work in. Okay. But now let's take a deep dive and structure this. What's the main claim of the argument? We know, right? Photographers who work in color have an advantage. That's the main claim. What are the evidence given? Magazines use more color photographs. Newspapers are also using more color photographs. And portrait studios are also using color photographs more than black and white. And of course, more types of color film are available for use as compared to black and white. Now, how do we build an argument? We have to try and find flaws in this argument. Right? It will not be a scenario where the argument is completely flawless, in which case all you can say is, oh, very nice agreement, thank you. Right? That's not the purpose of the AWT exercise. There are always flaws in the argument. There are ways in which the argument can be improved, which is the kind of recommendation that you will make. So let's look at it. So this is how the first paragraph will look like. Right? These are different ways in which you can phrase it, but basically you are presenting in your own words the argument made by the author concisely. Right? The argument presented in the given paragraph is that photographers who work in color have a distinct advantage over those who work in black and white. And in support of this particular argument, the author has provided the facts, provided the evidence that magazines and newspapers are using color photographs, so are portrait studios, and there are more types of color films available. Okay. The first part is very straightforward. You are giving your assessment of, this is the conclusion, this is the evidence. Identifying the clause. Okay. What kind of flaws could be there? Right? This is just an interesting way of looking at it, right? It is the cause and effect part, right? Somebody famously says correlation is not causation. So on the left-hand panel, we have correlation. Married people are happier, right? But it does not mean that marriage makes people happy. It is possible that happy people get married. Right? So the cause is, just because A and B are correlated does not mean that A is a cause of B. It could be that B is a cause of A. It could be that both A and B are caused by something else. Or it could just be a coincidence. Anyway, let's look at this particular argument. Okay. First thing is, what do you mean by success? Because the main argument is a photographer is who wants to be more successful should use color photographs. But then success is very ambiguous. Right? So what does success mean? So is publishing your photographs in magazines success? Possibly. Is it the only type of success? Does the photographer want to be published in a magazine? Does the photographer want to be published in a newspaper? Does the photographer want to work in a studio and make portraits? Then we look at things like this, the quantifiers. Color photographs are more true to life. Magazines use more color photographs. Many newspapers are starting to use color photographs. Most portrait studios use more color than black and white. Does it mean that black and white has no scope at all? Not really. It's a quantifier kind of stuff. Then, sometimes the evidence is actually irrelevant. There are more types of color film than black and white. How does it matter? Suppose there are 6 types of color film and only 3 types of black and white film. Are 3 types of black and white film enough? If they are of good quality, then probably they're enough. Does the different types of color film actually give you an advantage? May not be. So these are subtle ways of looking at flaws. Right? Now, why am I calling this as smaller flaws? Because there is some truth in what the author is saying. We are saying it may not be the complete truth. We are not negating anything that the author is saying, but we are saying that, look, maybe the photographer's definition of success is different from getting published in newspapers, magazines, or portrait studios. We are saying, okay, maybe more color photos are used, but black and white are also being used. Okay. Look at this. Okay. So here evidence is given that newspapers, magazines, and portrait studios. Suppose we agree that if you want to work for newspaper, magazine, or portrait studio, color is better. Agreed? But are they the only 3 areas where photographers can work? Not really. There are other type of, for example, let us say for wildlife photography, this is better. Black and white is better. Suppose I specialize in astronomical photography. Maybe black and white is better there. Right? So it is possible that for certain types of photography, color is better. For other types of work, black and white is better. Okay. Second, very strongly, it shows that color and black and white, that either you have to work with color or you have to work with black and white. But why is it? Right? Yes, there are some specialist T20 players like Suryakumar Yadav who seem to play only T20. But there are people like Jasprit Bumrah who are there in tests, who could possibly be there in ODI, also be there in T20. Right? So the question now we are asking is, look, why can't a photographer use both color and black and white? Is the way of photography, is the skill set really that different? That somebody who works in color cannot work in black and white, somebody works in black and white cannot work in color? Can a photographer say, okay, depending on what kind of subject I'm photographing, what kind of subject that I'm actually targeting, I can choose color or black and white? Or simply for the same subject, I will take some color shots and some photography shots? Right. The other argument that you will look at is, look, maybe less photographs are published in magazines, less black and white photographs are published. But what if they pay more? That because black and white photographs are rare, because they have some specific advantages. A magazine might use less black and white, but they actually pay more for good black and white photographs. Then you can be very successful as a black and white photographer. The other thing is, most of the evidence given talks about the demand side. Magazines want more color. That's the demand side. Demand for color photos. Newspapers are also now using color photographs, which means there is more demand for color. Portrait studios are using color. That's again more demand for color. But remember, the pricing depends on demand and supply. What about the supply side? Because there is more demand for color, maybe almost every photographer is chasing color. Then you can have a very profitable niche. Since 9 out of 10 photographers are going for color, if you go for black and white, you are unique. And whenever there is a demand for black and white, you charge your price. Right. To answer your question, Riddhi, very rarely does this particular AWT require specialized knowledge. I mean, it technically can happen. Suppose there's an argument made about some banking or inflation or something, but is unlikely, because that is not the objective. The objective of this exercise is to identify your ability to look at flaws in the argument, to understand the structure of an argument, see how it can be strengthened, see how it can be weakened, try to identify gaps in reasoning. That is the focus. But anyway, basic current affairs might be required, but that's not going to be the focus area, and you are anyway preparing a lot on current affairs, so don't worry too much about it. Right? What we don't know, this is information that we don't know, and this information can, if true, can affect the conclusion. Are color photographs first paid the same amount as black and white? We don't know. If they are paid more, it makes sense to be a color photographer. If they are paid less, then it makes sense to be a black and white photographer. Is the expertise the same or different? If it is the same, then you can actually specialize in both, depending on the demand. If the magazine asks for color, you give them color. If they ask for black and white, you give them black and white. Right? So these are typically some of the flaws. Okay, but please understand, you don't need too many. Work with 2, maximum 3 of the major flaws that you can find. Ideally, look for the big flaws. If you can't find the big flaw, you can question the ambiguity or the irrelevant evidences. But totally, you will pick only 2, maximum 3 flaws. You will not have time to explain. Right? Okay. So this is kind of puts all the flaws together in one place. Okay. So this is how the paragraph 1 looks like. The author concludes that photographers who work in color have an advantage photograph. To arrive at that conclusion, the author claims that it is more used in magazines and studios, and also that nowadays newspapers are also using color, and there are more types of color films. However, the argument has serious defects. The argument relies on ambiguous words and possibly non-representative samples. Also, there are some assumptions without enough evidence. Right? So this is how the paragraphs. What are the flaws? What are the main problem? Start with the biggest flaw that you can find, then additional problem, and then give your recommendation. Each flaw, you're saying, okay, this is a flaw, Why do you think it's a flaw? If possible, give an example. Illustrate the flaw. For example, here we are saying that, for example, one of the flaw is that the argument considers only the demand side of the equation. That yes, there is a greater demand for color photographs, but there could also be a greater, the author does not consider the supply side, there could also be a greater supply of color photographers, which will make sure that the price that they get is less, and a black and white photographer being unique can possibly command a premium. Right? So here it says author's terms like successful and advantageous are unclear or ambiguous. The author seems to focus on only on the quantity of work that is available. He also ignores the remuneration that you can get. For example, suppose black and white photography is half the availability in terms of demand, but if the money paid is double, then the net income would be the same. The second is the saying that based on 3 examples, magazines, newspapers, and portrait studios, the author generalizes that overall there is a greater demand for color photography over black and white photography. However, we have to understand that how important are these 3 areas of work in terms of the total amount of work that a photographer has. Even if we assume that there is more demand for color photography, you could have a scenario where there's a huge supply of color photographers and a shortage of black and white, which means that working in color may not be advantageous. It makes sense? We've already done that, right? But let's kind of break it down now, right? So what are the issues? The first paragraph is the same. You're only explaining in your words, simple, concise manner, what the argument. The argument presented in the passage says that giving space to teenagers is a bad idea because it creates distances and negatively affects relationships. The author assumes that having a distance between family members is bad for society, and therefore giving space is wrong and lead to unhealthy relationships. 2 important flaws in the reasoning includes generalization and false dilemma. Right? One is basically saying that you are generalizing the case by saying that giving space always and automatically creates negative relationships without really providing any evidence to support the claim. The argument implies that all teenagers react in a negative way, which is not always the case. And you can even add here and saying that the author fails to take into account the culture, the social structure, and the family structure, which are different from family to family. Equally important, argument fails to give any evidence that giving space harms relationships. Giving a certain amount of space could actually help teenagers by develop independence, maturity, and therefore it could actually be essential to the healthy growth of a teenager. The false dilemma basically says that it kind of creates a cause and effect, with one cause leading inevitably to a one solution. That if you give space, it will lead to unhealthy relationships. They are not counting the other factors, like the level of trust that is there, like the clarity of communication that is there between the different people, the amount of respect that each family member gives the others, all that is not considered. The affection, the quality time, all the other factors are being ignored. So one is The author is to provide more evidence to the claim that giving space leads to negative relationships. They should also consider other factors which contribute. Second, the author should provide evidence that uh, how and what amount of space can be given and how much is too much. And the author should acknowledge that in some cases it may actually be beneficial. And then, yep, that's how the conclusion gets weakened. Okay. So I think while it looks a little tricky at this particular period of time, as you do some practice, it's not that difficult. It appears tough because it is new. You've not done this kind of work before, right? And it's actually fun when you start taking apart arguments and then trying to think of a physical person who's making this argument and that you want to counter him badly, right? And that is lovely motivation. You keep coming up very creative ways to counter the arguments being made here, right? Please understand, as I said before, it is not necessary to completely throw the argument under the bus and say, look, this entire argument is unfit and should be thrown in the dustbin. No, you're recommending how the argument can be improved. You're pointing out the flaws like a teacher. Assume that a student has written this argument and presented to you. You are the English teacher now. You are telling them, okay, बेटा ये गलती कर दिया, ये गलती किया, इसको ऐसे सुधारो, argument तुम्हारी better हो जाएगी. Right? That is fundamentally what is expected of you. Right? So that's broadly what I wanted to cover. Yes. What questions can I take? Let me reiterate, please take 5 minutes to plan. If you don't take that 5 minutes to plan and start writing straight away, you will end up with an unstructured essay. And this advice is true both for WAT and AWT. Right. For additional practice, you can find topics available online. I think CL on their site has shared a few. Similarly, you could look at GMAT's analysis of arguments. Right? I'm not sure if it is there as a part of the new focus GMAT, but it used to be a part of GMAT, used to be a part of GRE also once in a while. A certain time back. So all those are available. You could go to sites like GMAT Club and actually get written arguments. Okay. Can't see any more questions. Neha, are there any more questions? No? Manya, yes, that's see, in general, and this is advice for both writing as well as interviews, it makes sense to use simpler language. I think what you need to be is the message going across. The risk of using more fancy vocab is that you could end up conveying a meaning which is slightly different from what you want to convey, right? So I think rather than give a generalized advice, I'll say, look, try to keep it simple, try to keep it straightforward. Remember, you can't craft an essay like a piece of art because you have 20-25 minutes. Second thing is that unless you're very sure about the kind of words that you're looking for and the meaning is very clear, that you know the word exactly, you know it well, you've used it before, it makes sense to substitute it with a simpler word. right? We have some amazingly effective writers who do not use fancy vocab. I think for all that, if you read Shashi Tharoor's books, he doesn't use all that fancy vocab. So it's more like a fun thing that he plays around and uses words on social media for fun. He doesn't use such fancy vocab in his actual books and essays that he writes. Okay, you are being assessed for your ability to understand an argument, understand the flaws of the argument, and uh, how well you are able to present your recommendations, right? You will not be assessed based on your literary skills or your vocab. But yes, the basic hygiene factor, things like spellings and grammar, has to be right, which again makes it easier for me. The simpler the word, the more likely your spelling is right. The simpler the sentence, the more likely your grammar is right. The minute I go into three phrase sentences, somewhere my grammar will go wrong. But with simple sentences, it's very unlikely for simple and direct sentences, very unlikely my grammar will go wrong. Right? I think that seems to be it. If there are no more questions, thank you so much. Make sure that you follow the advice given today. Make sure that you practice. Knowing the theory is just one part of it. At least 4 or 5 proper analysis with a timer on the side, right? 5 minutes to plan and 20 minutes to write. Make sure you do that. And like with WAT, without a conclusion, your essay is incomplete. So the conclusion in this case is recommendations on how this essay or argument can be improved. That is critical. I would rather have a shorter essay with a good final paragraph. But if the final paragraph is incomplete, then you have not done your job. We talked about it, right? First paragraph typically is explain the argument in your words. What is the argument given to you? Right? The second paragraph, you say, okay, this argument is wrong for XYZ reasons. Third and fourth paragraph, you take 2 important mistakes that the author has made. Explain them. And last paragraph, you give your recommendations on how the argument can be improved. Okay, remember, we have given you a lot of different possible flaws that can happen in argument. In a given argument, every flaw may not be there. Second, even if an argument has 5 flaws, please talk about 2 of them or max 3 of them if you have the time. Do not try to point out every possible flaw in the argument. You don't have the time. Okay. Thank you very much and all the best. Signing off.